This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video we're going to continue our study of Lesson 30 in Alvarez's Latin Grammar. In the previous video, which we can call Part 1 of Lesson 30, we studied the first half of the pronouns listed in Lesson 30, and in this Part 2 we'll study the second half. The topic of Lesson 30 is the declensions of pronouns. Let's pick up where we left off without spending any time on review. If you'd like to review Part 1, you can do so by watching that video separately. In Part 1, we saw that the first person personal pronoun in the singular was ego, I. And the first person personal pronoun in the plural was nos, we. We also saw that in the singular, the second person personal pronoun was tu. And in the plural, the second person personal pronoun was vos. So we had ego and nos for the first person, and tu and vos for the second person. If we were to ask whether there is a Latin third person personal pronoun, the best answer would be this next pronoun on our list, which, if we zoom in on it here, we can see is the pronoun is, ea, id. Is, ea, id, which translates as he, she, and it. As I said, this is the most basic third person personal pronoun in Latin. Is, ea, id. He, she, it. So let's look at the declension of is, ea, id. We see the masculine nominative form in the singular is is. Is, which is translated he. We then see the genitive eius, which means of him. Of him. And then the dative ei, to or for him. We then see the accusative eum, him, and the ablative ab, eo, which means from him. So the declension of is in the singular number is is, eius, ei, eum, eo. If we look at the feminine, we see the nominative eia, which means she. She, eia. For the genitive, we see eius, which here would mean of her. The dative ei, which would mean to or for her. Instead of eum in the feminine, we have eam. Eam. And then in the ablative, instead of eo in the feminine, we have eia. Eia. So the declension is eia, she, eius, of her, ei, to or for her, eam, her, and ab, eia, from her. Moving over to the neuter, we see id, which is easy to remember because it's translated it in English. Id, it. The genitive would be eius, of it, ei, to or for it. The accusative would be id, which is translated as it. And the ablative ab, eo, which means from it. So this is the declension of is, ea, id in the singular number. Let's slide over and look at the plural number. We see that the nominative plural for the masculine is ee. Ee. Ee would be translated they, third person, plural, masculine. Next we see eorum. Eorum, the genitive plural, of them. We then see in the dative iis, iis, to or for them. We see that the dative can be iis or eis. So don't think that eis is a feminine form. That's not what this is showing us. Iis is an option for iis. Iis, vel, or eis. So don't let that confuse you. So the dative plural is iis, to or for them. Then the accusative is eos, and then the ablative plural is iis, ab iis, from them. If we look at the feminine, we see that the nominative plural is ei in classical Latin, or eae in ecclesiastical Latin. The genitive plural is earum. The dative is then iis or eis. The accusative is eas, which would be translated as them, referring to a female group. And lastly, iis or eis for the ablative case. That's the declension of the feminine plural. And then lastly, the neuter, we see ea in the nominative. It would mean those things or they. Eorum, genitive plural, of them, referring to neuter things. And then we would have for the dative iis or eis, to or for them. Then over to the accusative, we'd have ea for the accusative plural, which means them. And lastly, the ablative ab iis or ab eis. The same ablative form for all three genders. So that's the declension of the pronoun is, ea, id, he, she, it, and in the plural, they and them. Now, our next pronoun is another demonstrative pronoun, and I have some good news for you. This next pronoun is a compound or a derivative that's formed from is, ea, id. If you look, every one of these forms in the next pronoun ends with the suffix dem. Every single form ends in dem. A little tip to help you translate this pronoun is that anytime you see a pronoun ending in dem, translate it the same. And you'll see that in examples in Latin reading, where this pronoun is translated as the same. Notice, however, that the forms change in front of that suffix, that dem suffix. The forms go through all their normal changes, just as we studied with is, ea, id, and then the suffix dem is added on after the form changes. So make sure you can see that. The ending of every one of these pronouns is dem, and then the first part of the pronouns goes through the normal changes of the cases, just like is, ea, and id. Okay? Now there's one thing I want to make sure you notice in these forms, and that's that down here in the accusative, we don't have eum and eam, but eun and ean. Where did the n come from? This is a very simple example of what's called euphony, or good sounding. It's very difficult to say eum with an m and then add the suffix dem. Eum, dem is hard to say. And so in ecclesiastical history, the spelling was changed from eum and eam to eun and ean. And the reason why is very simple to understand. If you say eum dem, you'll notice that it's difficult. But if you say eun dem, you'll see that that's actually very simple and easy. And that's why the change was made, to simply make pronunciation more clear. So if we know the declension of is, ea, id, then we also know the declension of idem, eadem, idem. You just need to remember that we have the declension of is, ea, id with a suffix dem added to the pronoun. The same is true over in the plural number. If we look at the plural forms for this pronoun, they're exactly the same as what we have up here with dem added as a suffix. Very, very easy. Same forms with the suffix dem. Easy to learn. Okay? Next pronoun. The next pronoun we see is a possessive pronoun that's drawn from the first person personal pronoun. There we saw ego, mei, and we see that mei there in the first person personal pronoun, and that becomes the foundation or stem for this possessive pronoun. We can see that meus, mea, meum is declined just like bonus, bona, bonum. So if you know how to decline bonus, bona, bonum, then you already know how to decline meus, mea, meum. This is the first person possessive pronoun and is normally translated my. There's also a second person possessive pronoun, tuus, tua, tuum. That's the second person possessive pronoun, and whereas meus means my, tuus means your. There's also a plural first person possessive pronoun, noster, nostra, and nostrum is a first person plural possessive pronoun. And there's also a second person plural possessive pronoun, vester, vestra, vestrum. All of these have been used throughout history, and if you understand the grammar, you'll understand the significance of the different pronoun forms. Let's move on here because Alvarez only gave us one possessive pronoun to learn, so obviously he didn't intend for us to spend a lot of time on the declension of possessive pronouns. The next pronoun we'll study is nostras, down here, and in the previous lesson we learned that there are some pronouns that are called Gentile pronouns. And nostras is an example of a Gentile pronoun. A Gentile pronoun refers or has the idea of nationality, being a member of a tribe or a clan. And when you say our, you mean belonging to the tribe or belonging to the group. Nostras is translated our. And you can see the declension. This pronoun isn't very common, but you simply need to make sure you're aware that such a pronoun exists when you see it in your Latin reading. But you can see here the declension of the pronoun nostras, according to the third declension. Nostras, nostratis, sorry about that, nostrati in the dative, nostratem in the accusative singular, o nostras in the vocative, and a nostrate in the ablative. If we slide over, we can see the plural forms. And again, this is just very normal third declension forms. We see nostrates in the masculine plural, nostratia in the neuter, nostratium, the genitive for all three declensions, nostratibus in the dative, nostrates in the accusative, o nostrates in the vocative, and a nostratibus in the ablative plural. And we see that as far as the neuter is concerned, just the nominative, the accusative, and the vocative are changed, but they all agree with one another. So that's the declension of nostras, our. The next set of pronouns we have are called relative pronouns because they relate back to something that was already said. They're the relative pronouns. And we can see in the singular number we have the pronoun qui, que, and quod. Qui, que, and quod. These are relative pronouns, and they are normally translated with the English pronouns who and what. The masculine and feminine pronouns are translated as who, and the neuter is normally translated as what. Qui, que, quod. You can see the genitive for all three genders is cujus. That means of whom or whose. Cui is the dative singular, meaning to or for whom. Quem is the masculine singular. And quem translates into English as whom. Whom. Who would be the nominative case. Whom would be the object of the action of the nominative case. And then lastly, there's no vocative, and in the ablative we have a quo. A quo, from whom. And that's true for all three genders. The only other things we need to learn is that the accusative singular for que is quam, and the accusative singular for quod is the same, quod. That's the declension of qui, que, quod, which means who or what, in each of the three genders in the singular number. Now, if we slide over to the plural, we'll find recognizable forms here. We have qui in the nominative plural, que in the feminine nominative plural, and que in the neuter plural. Quorum, of whom, quarum, of whom being feminine, and quorum, of whom being neuter. Queis, vel quibis in the dative, meaning to or for whom. No vocative cases, and then a queis or quibus in the ablative case. From whom. And these are the plural declensions of the pronoun qui, que, quod. Who, or which, or what. Or that, I should say. That. Who, which, and that. the relative pronouns. Now, if we slide back over and down, we'll see that the next pronoun is quis, which looks very much like qui. Actually, the forms, if you look almost exactly the same. The reason why is because quis is used to ask questions. Quis is used to ask who. It's not the same as qui. An example of qui would be like, I read a story about George Washington, who was the first president of the United States. There, who serves the original purpose as a relative. But quis is used to ask a question. To ask who. One would use quis or que or quod. These here are interrogative pronouns. They're used to ask a question. Quis, as in the Gospel of St. John, we read, quis es? Who are you? Quis es? That's used in the masculine, then que in the feminine, and quod in the neuter. This is an example of an interrogative pronoun. And if we look over at the plural, we find the same exact declension as we saw for the relative pronoun qui. Qui, que, and que. Exactly the same forms for the relative pronoun qui, que, quod, and the interrogative pronoun quis, que, quod. With that, we come to the end of Lesson 30. Now, I know that's a lot of content to go over in a single lesson, but I simply wanted to provide you with an overview, and it took 2 relatively short videos. But we've been through all of the declensions now in Lesson 30, and that's a great first step in mastering this lesson. Now, you need to study this lesson for mastery, work on memorizing all of the forms, and complete your lesson assessments. I hope you found this walkthrough to be helpful. If you have any questions or need any help, please get in touch. God bless your studies.